live in the South, a place to sort of organize around, because many of us had families who were either directly from the South or certainly had relatives down there, so it gave people a thing to sort of plug into. Now, what starts to get raised in that video around the conversation of SNCC, right? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating, oh, my voice is cracking like I'm 12. Coordinating committee with some of the older generation of civil rights activists is where we start to see some of these tensions around different segments and different needs of the Black community that need to be met not being addressed. Right, so the conflict, essentially in a couple sentences between, or that grew between SNCC and say, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was just around tactics and actually around this question of is our main battle as SCLC, sort of positioned, although there's some difference there even, is our main focus and battle, integration with desegregation, or do we really need to be talking about, and certainly by 1965, SNCC starts to articulate this more about Black power and Black liberation, right? Some of those differences had to do not only with age, as they are kind of described in that film, in kind of a different sort of political framework for younger Black organizers and activists, but some of it was also around geography, right? Because in the South, it was very clear. Segregation was the kind of logical next step, or desegregation was the sort of logical next step in undoing, a friend of mine would say the white racial state, right? But in the North, again, things look similar in communities in terms of folks being definitely segregated, but they weren't written into law necessarily as such. And other sorts of issues existed in those communities in northern cities, in western cities, particularly in Los Angeles, which we see in the Watts riots and whatever. You couldn't organize the way you could in the southern states around some of those issues. Why, right? And some of those are things that we are kind of dealing with nationally, if you ask me at this point, right? When people ask that question about why are Black communities, organizing. So in the South, you had very stable communities, right? Very stable communities. Some of it was due to segregation itself, right? If you're forced to live and function and operate within a sort of community, neighborhood, or whatever, and know that you really can't rely on essentially whatever your municipal protection, police, garbage pickup, feeding hungry children, whatever. You have to do all that, right, as a community, right? And so those things force people, the Black community was already in the South highly organized because it had to be, right? So you have a community that's already highly organized, partly because of the issue of segregation itself and what it meant in terms of how communities had to function. But then you also have these institutions, right, which the church, Black Christian church was one of the primary institutions within Black Southern communities that sort of helped pull a lot of those things together that weren't necessarily about politics or about being political per se, but just were people had to do these things in order to live, so the community could survive and thrive. So when you have those two things, you have communities that are already stable, folks have lived in the same place for decades, if not centuries, right? Their families have been, really in the same locales. You have a community that's already highly organized already, and then you have institutional structures in place that already bring tons of people together in any particular situation. You have a situation that's actually ripe to do lots of mass mobilizing. You with me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, in the North, things looked a little bit different. Things looked a little bit different. Why? Part of it is in most of the urban centers, which is where most black folks in the North lived in, you had a couple different things at play, right? You had, and some of them very different from those southern communities. You had a lot of transients, right? Partly due to the Great Migration and folks trying to, flee the South. One, either for economic opportunity, or two, to get away from, just like racist, kind of extra legal violence, right, and under like lynching and whatnot. Folks were just trying to get the hell out, quite frankly, right? And so you had, since basically the turn of the century into the 60s, huge numbers of black folks leaving the South in different ways, like first migration, folks basically tout from like the turn of the century up until like the 1920s, right? Folks leaving the South as much as possible. Second migration happens in the 50s and 60s. Folks leaving the South again, going into northern cities, right? So you have folks already like moving around in transit, not rooted in a particular place. You also have, and this is something I'm just beginning to learn more about. There's a book that I'm reading now that's really fantastic called Root Shock, written by this psychiatrist, Mindy Fuller out of Columbia. And the book is about urban development and urban renewal in America, the period from 1940 to 1972, where our highways were built, where many of our urban centers were sort of reconfigured and restructured. Central business district, new buildings went up, stadiums went up, or whatever, and mostly through black communities in the North. So even in cities where there had been very, somewhat stable communities where people lived, in communities regardless of, income or whatever, there was a sort of solid black community there. Those communities were disrupted through the process of urban renewal. So, and it happened in some southern cities too. I lived in New Orleans for a year, and there's a street in New Orleans called Claiborne, right? And the north side of Claiborne, in downtown New Orleans, was had been at one point the place for the thriving black businesses in New Orleans, right? And New Orleans has a long, sort of history of, black economic development through having so many, kind of free black population living there throughout the slave period or whatever. So it was and I've seen pictures of it, prior to the 1960s, where Claiborne was this gorgeous street with all these huge oak trees and all these businesses lined up, along the street. And that was one of the major black sort of economic centers of New Orleans. The U.S. government drove a highway through it, I-10. If you've driven down I-10 in New Orleans, it goes right over that business district, and if you've ever walked it, you see what it looks like to this day, right? So, according to Dr. Fullerlove and her research, 1,900 black communities were destroyed through urban development from 1940 to 1972, creating what? Further instability, further transience, right? And so those same sort of organizing tactics that were used in the South, can't really use in a situation where people aren't stable. Those same institutions don't necessarily exist in that configuration, or folks, in more urban settings, not everybody's going to church on Sunday or whatever. Those create different sort of set of conditions to do organizing work. Right? And those tensions start to get raised throughout the civil rights movement when all these cities start to erupt, in fire in the late 60s. A lot of it is due to that. I mean, and there's another documentary that American